On this day in history, Justin Bieber is born. In 1872, Yellowstone becomes the world's first national park. In 1973, Pink Floyd releases their album Dark Side of the Moon. And finally, in 1854, the SS City Glasgow leaves Liverpool Harbor with 480 people and was never seen again. But did you know? On this day in 1907, the U.S. bans slave trade within the U.S. effective January 1, 1808. In 2002, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan starts. Dr. Seuss is also born on this day. And finally, in 1933, King Kong premieres at Radio City Music Hall. But did you know? On this day in 1873, the U.S. Congress enacts the Comstock Law, making it illegal to send any obscene, lewd, or lascivious books through the mail. In 1861, Russia frees serfs and grants them full rights as free citizens. And finally, in 2013, a 2-year-old becomes the first child born with HIV to be cured. But did you know? On this date in 1924, Happy Birthday to You is published by Clayton Sonny. In 1936, the first flight of airship Hindenburg happens. And finally, on this day, many presidents, including Jefferson, Lincoln, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, are inaugurated. But did you know? This day in 1770, the Boston Massacre happens when British soldiers kill 5 men in a crowd that were throwing snowballs, stones, and sticks at them. This further hurt British colony relations. In 1496, King Henry VII grants John Cabot a commission to explore new lands. He later discovered Newfoundland and Cape Breton Island on the North American coast. And finally, in 1558, smoking tobacco is introduced into Europe by Francisco Ferdinand. But did you know? On this day in 1836, the famous Battle of the Alamo happens. In 1899, aspirin is patented by Bayer. And finally, in 2018, the world's oldest message in a bottle is found in Western Australia, said to be 132 years old. But did you know? On this day in 1876, Alexander Bell receives the patent for the telephone. In 1912, the discovery of the South Pole is announced. In 1908, Cincinnati Mayor Mark Brees stands before a city council and says women are not physically fit to operate automobiles. And finally, in 1936, Germany breaks the Treaty of Versailles by sending troops into the Rhineland. But did you know? On this day in 2014, Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 loses contact and disappears, prompting the most expensive search effort in history. In 1817, the New York Stock Exchange is founded. And finally, in 1971, Joe Frazier ends Muhammad Ali's 31-fight winning streak and is dubbed the Fight of the Century. But did you know? On this day in 1961, the Soviet flight Sputnik 9 carries and returns from orbit a dog, frog, and a guinea pig. In 1959, Barbie makes her debut at the American Toy Fair in New York. And finally, in 1974, the last Japanese soldier operating in the Philippines surrenders 29 years after World War II ended. But did you know? On this day in 1862, the U.S. issues first paper money in form of $5, $10, $20, $50, $100, $500, and $1,000 note bills. Chuck Norris and Carrie Underwood both have birthdays today. And finally, in 1876, the first telephone call happens with Alexander Bell calling his assistant. But did you know? On this day in 2020, COVID-19 is declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. In 2018, China's Congress approved removal of term limits for leaders. And finally, in 1917, the first NHL championship game was played. But did you know? On this day in 1894, Coca-Cola is sold in bottles for the first time in a candy store in Mississippi. In 1918, Vladimir Lenin shifts the capital of Russia from Petrograd to Moscow. And finally, in 1994, the Church of England ordains its first ever 33 female priest. But did you know? On this day in 1930, Clyde Tombaugh announces the discovery of Pluto. And in 1781, William Herschel sees what he thinks of the comet, but it's actually the discovery of Uranus. In 1852, Uncle Sam cartoon figure makes his debut in New York Lantern Weekly. And finally, in 2003, the Journal of Nature reports a 350,000-year-old footprint of an upright walking human found in Italy. But did you know? On this day in 1950, the FBI's Most Wanted Fugitive program begins. In 1794, Eli Whitney patents the cotton gin. In 1900, the U.S. currency goes on the gold standard. In 2013, Xi Jinping is named the president of China. Einstein, Stephen Curry, and Simon Biles all have birthdays today. And finally, in 1931, the first theater built for rear movie projection opens. But did you know? On this day in 44 BC, Julius Caesar is stabbed to death by Roman senators. In 1493, Christopher Columbus returns to Spain after his first voyage to the New World. In 1985, the first internet domain name is registered. And finally, in 2019, climate change strikes held by school children take place around the world inspired by Greta Thunberg. But did you know? On this day in 1935, Adolf Hitler orders German rearmament in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. In 1900, Sir Arthur Evans rediscovers the Bronze Age city of Knossos in Crete, home of the legendary Minotaur. And finally, in 1968, General Motors produces its 100 millionth automobile. But did you know? On this day in 1845, the rubber band is patented in London. In 1898, John Holland achieves a successful test run for the first submarine, submerging for an hour and 40 minutes. And finally, in 1905, Einstein finishes his paper detailing quantum theory of light, one of the foundations for modern physics. But did you know? On this day in 1990, the largest art robbery in the US happens. $500 million of art is stolen. In 1942, two black players, Jackie Robinson and Nate Moreland, request a tryout for the White Sox and are allowed to try out. In 1965, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov becomes the first person to walk in space. And finally, in 1922, British magistrates in India sentenced Gandhi to 6 years imprisonment for disobedience. But did you know? On this day in 1920, the US Senate rejects the Treaty of Versailles for the second time, refusing to ratify the League of Nations. In 2003, the invasion of Iraq starts with airstrikes by American and British-led coalition. And finally, in 1863, a Confederate cruiser is destroyed on her maiden voyage with cargo and medicines valued over $1 million. And in 192 years later, on the same day, the wreckage is found by a teenage diver. But did you know? On this day in 2016, Barack Obama becomes the first US president to visit Cuba since 1928. In 1815, Napoleon enters Paris after his escape from Elba and begins a 100-day rule. And finally, in 1852, Harriet Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin is published in Boston. But did you know? On this day in 2014, Russia formally annexes Crimea amid international condemnation. In 1975, Ethiopia abolishes this monarchy it held for 3,000 years. In 2013, the European Space Agency reveals new data suggesting the universe is 13.82 billion years old. And finally, in 1962, Yogi the bear becomes the first creature to be ejected at supersonic speeds by US military testing ejection seats. Although the bear did survive, it was later put down to study the impacts of the ejection. But did you know? On this day in 1903, Niagara Falls runs out of water due to a drought. In 1963, the Beatles released their first album. In 1765, the Stamp Act is passed, which is the first direct tax on the American colonists. In 1965, the US confirms its troops used chemical warfare against the Viet Cong. And finally, in 2018, the US President Donald Trump imposed $60 billion for tariffs on Chinese imports. But did you know? On this day in 1933, the Enabling Act is passed in Germany, giving Adolf Hitler dictatorial powers. In 1775, Patrick Henry proclaims, "Give me liberty or give me death." And finally, in 1857, Alicia Otis installs his first elevator at 488 Broadway in New York City. But did you know? On this day in 1944, Nicholas Alchemade survives a jump from 18,000 feet over Germany without a parachute. His fall was broken by pine trees and soft snow, and he only received a sprained leg. In 1837, Canada gives its black citizens the right to vote. And finally, in 1999, NATO commences an air bombardment against Yugoslavia, making it the first time NATO has attacked a sovereign country. But did you know? On this day in 1954, RCA manufactures the first color TV set 12.5-inch screen for $1,000. In 1807, the British Parliament abolishes the slave trade throughout the British Empire. And finally, in 2019, a British Airways flight from London mistakenly flies to Edinburgh, Scotland instead of Dusseldorf, Germany when the wrong flight plan was submitted. But did you know? On this day in 2015, Richard III of England is reburied in England after being discovered under a car park in 2012. In 1953, Dr. Salk announces that he successfully tested a vaccine to prevent polio. And finally, in 1845, a patent is awarded for adhesive medicated plaster, the precursor to the Band-Aid. But did you know? On this day in 1533, Juan Ponce de Leon and his expedition see Florida for the first time. In 1625, Charles I ascends the English throne, and Fergie and Mariah Carey both have birthdays today. But did you know? On this day in 2017, the largest dinosaur footprint at 1.7 meters is found in Western Australia. In 1854, Britain and France declare war on Russia. And Reba McEntire, Vince Vaughn, and Lady Gaga all have a birthday today. But did you know? On this day in 1974, Chinese farmers discover a terracotta army, 8,000 clay warrior statues buried to guard the tomb of China's first emperor. In 1795, Ludwig van Beethoven has his debut performance as a pianist in Vienna. And finally, in 1901, Edmund Barton is elected Prime Minister in Australia's first parliamentary election. But did you know? On this date in 2040 BC, the first recorded passage of Halley's Comet happens. In 1867, the Alaska Purchase happens. U.S. buys Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. In 1870, the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is adopted, granting rights to vote regardless of race. And finally, Robbie Coltrane and Celine Dion both have birthdays today. But did you know? On this day in 1889, the Eiffel Tower officially opens in Paris. Ewan McGregor, Bart Descartes, and Christopher Walken all have birthdays today. And finally, Thomas Peterson becomes the first African American to vote in the US. But did you know?